On Tuesday, March 12th, I watched my last name settle into the official records of Travis County, and for the first time in my life, it wasn't followed by a sigh. The clerk rotated her monitor toward me. Hannah Mercer, sole owner. The words sat there in black type under the legal description of a narrow mixed-use property on the east side of Austin. 2 upstairs rental units, 1 storefront below. A modest building, brick faded from years of Texas sun. Nothing flashy, but it was mine. For years, my parents had introduced me as our daughter who never finished law school. At church, at Thanksgiving, at any gathering where someone asked what I did for a living. The word failure was never said outright in public, but it lingered in the pauses after my name. At home, it was said more directly. Now my name was attached to something that could not be dismissed. It was attached to land, to square footage, to a deed recorded at 10:17 in the morning on a regular business Tuesday, witnessed and logged like any other lawful transaction in this state. The clerk smiled politely. "You'll be able to pull a copy online by this afternoon," she said. "It updates pretty fast. Public record." That was the part I'd thought about the most. By noon, my phone vibrated while I was still in my car outside the county building. My mother's name flashed across the screen. We saw the record. No congratulations, no questions about the property itself, just that single sentence followed by, "Call us." I stared at the message and let the engine idle. My parents lived 45 minutes south in San Marcos. They had never once asked how my bookkeeping firm in Austin was doing beyond a passing comment about whether I had considered a more stable career, but somehow within hours of the deed being filed, they had found the listing. County records told a different story than the one they'd been repeating about me for years. I drove toward the property instead of calling back. The building sat on a corner lot near a bus line walking distance from a senior apartment complex. I'd run the numbers carefully steady rental income upstairs room to expand my accounting practice downstairs. It wasn't a mansion. It was practical, sustainable, earned. Inside my bag, alongside the certified copy of the deed, was another set of papers I had filed earlier that morning. A sworn affidavit notarized and stamped referencing financial irregularities tied to my name from more than a decade ago. I hadn't told my parents about that part. Not yet. The documents were now attached to a formal dispute process. Logged, time-stamped, seen. My phone buzzed again. "Your father and I are coming to Austin tonight," my mother wrote. "We need to understand what you think you're doing." I looked up at the faded brick at the blank space above the storefront where a sign would eventually hang. For years they had called me a failure. Today the county said otherwise. What they didn't know was that the deed wasn't the only thing with my name on it. And this time I wasn't going to erase myself to make them comfortable. On Wednesday morning, the day after my name went into the Travis County records, I opened my office early and tried to work as if nothing had shifted. Mercer Accounting and Advisory still operated out of a leased suite near South Lamar. 2 desks, 1 aging printer, and a wall calendar filled with client deadlines. Most of my clients were small contractors, a pair of retired teachers managing rental income, and a landscaping company that had never once missed a payroll tax deposit on my watch. It was steady work, honest work, the kind my parents described as temporary. My father, Robert Mercer, liked to remind people that I had once been in law school at the University of Texas. He would say it with a tone that suggested I had abandoned something prestigious for something small. What he rarely mentioned was the debt, or the fact that I had been the one covering my own tuition and living expenses while Caleb lived at home saving for a down payment on a house. Caleb was 2 years younger than me and had never been called a risk. He worked in commercial insurance in San Marcos, married his college girlfriend, and bought a starter home near our parents. When my mother Diane spoke about him, her voice lifted. When she spoke about me, it flattened. "You're smart," she would say. "You just never stick with anything." It became a family refrain. When I built my client list from 3 accounts to 20, it was luck. When I hired a part-time assistant one tax season, it was overextending. When I paid off the last of my student loans, my father said, "Well, at least that's something." The word failure hovered around me like humidity in August, never visible, always felt. At 19, during my second year of undergrad, I discovered a credit card account in my name with a balance I didn't recognize. I had been living in a shared apartment in Austin at the time, working evenings at a bookstore. I drove home to San Marcos in a panic, the statement folded in my bag. My parents sat at the kitchen table and told me not to overreact. My father explained that he had opened it temporarily to cover materials for a renovation project when cash flow was tight. "It's all under control," he said. "We were going to tell you." My mother added that families helped each other, that it was technically in my name, but it was for the business, for all of us. I remember feeling embarrassed for having questioned them. I remember apologizing. The account was eventually paid down and life moved on, or at least that was the story we agreed to tell. Over the years, there were other small inconsistencies, an unfamiliar inquiry on my credit report, a mailed pre-approval notice addressed to me but sent to their home address. Each time there was a reasonable explanation, a clerical error, a mix-up. I accepted those explanations because pushing harder would have meant challenging the narrative that I was the unstable one. Now, sitting at my desk on a quiet Wednesday, the certified copy of my newly recorded deed lay inside a manila folder in my drawer. Beside it were notes from my lender about early credit irregularities that didn't match my income profile. For the first time, I wasn't willing to smooth it over. My phone buzzed again with a missed call from my mother. Failure in my family had always meant disappointing them, but as I stared at the folder containing both my deed and the beginning of a paper trail I had ignored for too long, I started to wonder whether failure had ever really been mine to carry. By Thursday afternoon, the quiet in my office felt different, not calm, focused. I had 3 browser tabs open: Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. My mortgage underwriter's email from the previous week sat flagged in my inbox: early accounts inconsistent with reported income history. Recommend full archive review. At the time, I had brushed it aside as an old paperwork glitch. Now, with my name officially recorded on a deed and my parents suddenly alert to my financial footprint, it didn't feel like a glitch anymore. It felt like a pattern. I paid the fees to pull archived credit reports going back 15 years. The documents were dense: account numbers, dates, opened payment histories, closed lines. Most of it aligned with my memory student loans, a modest car loan, a short-term business line of credit I'd closed responsibly. But 2 entries stood out. A credit card opened when I was 19. I knew about that one. I had chosen to believe the explanation. The second was harder to ignore. A small personal loan issued when I was 21 during my first semester of law school, $5,800. The application address listed was not my student apartment in Austin. It was my parents' business address in San Marcos, the same address printed on the side of my father's renovation trucks. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. I had been working part-time and living off loans and savings. I would have remembered applying for a personal loan. I would have remembered signing something. Instead of jumping to conclusions, I made a checklist: request full transaction history on the card and loan, obtain signature copies from the originating bank, confirm mailing addresses and IP logs if available. The next morning, Friday, I called the bank listed on the archived documents. After navigating through automated menus, I was transferred to a records department representative who explained that archived files older than 10 years required a formal written request. "I'll submit whatever you need," I said. She outlined the process: identity verification, notarized request, processing time. Her tone was procedural neutral. This was not a family drama. It was paperwork. That distinction steadied me. Later that afternoon, I met with the real estate attorney my lender had recommended, Laura Benton, a woman in her 40s with a reputation in Austin for being thorough without being theatrical. We sat in her office overlooking a parking lot lined with live oaks. I laid the printed credit reports on her desk. "I'm not looking to accuse anyone," I told her. "I just need to understand what's accurate." She reviewed the documents quietly. When she reached the personal loan entry, she paused. "Did you authorize this?" she asked. "I don't remember doing it." "That's not the same as no." "No," I said carefully. "It isn't. Laura explained that if signatures didn't match and the documentation supported it, I could file an identity theft affidavit and dispute the accounts formally. That would trigger investigations with the credit bureaus and possibly the bank's compliance department. It's a serious step, she said. Once you start, you can't quietly undo it. I nodded. I wasn't ready to start anything yet, but I was ready to know. As I left her office, my phone buzzed again, another message from my mother asking when we were going to clear up this misunderstanding about the property. I looked down at the archived report still open on my screen. For years, I had accepted the version of events handed to me. Now there was at least one entry on my credit history that didn't fit, and this time I intended to find out exactly why. On Sunday evening, 4 days after the deed was recorded, I drove down Interstate 35 to San Marcos with a folder in my passenger seat and a tightness in my chest I couldn't quite name. My parents' house hadn't changed in 20 years. Same brick exterior, same oak tree leaning slightly over the driveway, same wind chime my mother insisted was cheerful. Caleb's truck was parked out front, so they had made it a family meeting. Inside, the smell of pot roast and rosemary filled the kitchen. My mother moved between stove and table with a kind of clipped efficiency. My father stood near the counter, arms folded. Caleb sat already scrolling on his phone before glancing up at me. No one mentioned the drive. No one asked how I was. We sat down, plates filled, silverware arranged. Halfway through the meal, my mother reached beside her chair and slid a printed sheet of paper across the table toward me. It was a property appraisal estimate pulled from a public website. My building's address was circled in pen. You didn't think we'd find out, she asked, her voice calm but sharpened at the edges. I didn't hide it, I said. It's public record. That's not the point, my father replied. We hear about it from a neighbor who saw it online. You didn't say a word. Caleb leaned back in his chair. It's a big move, Hannah. Commercial property. That's risky. Risky. The word landed the way it always did, like a character assessment, not a financial one. It's structured responsibly, I said. Mixed use. 2 rental units upstairs. Positive cash flow projections. My father waved a hand. That's a lot of debt for someone who already struggled with money. I felt something shift inside me at that sentence. Struggled with money. When did I struggle? I asked. He looked at my mother, then back at me. You've always had issues. Credit, loans. Caleb's gaze flickered toward me, curious now. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet, not the full report, not the affidavit draft, just a summary from my lender noting early credit inconsistencies. My lender asked about a personal loan from when I was 21, I said carefully. $5,800, issued out of San Marcos, to your business address. Silence settled across the table. My mother set her fork down too precisely. That was years ago. So you remember it, I said. It was nothing, my father answered quickly. A temporary solution. We told you about the card. I'm not talking about the card, I said. This was a separate loan. Caleb frowned. Wait, there was another loan. My father's jaw tightened. You're making this sound bigger than it is. I'm asking questions, I said. My voice was steady, but my hands were cold. My mother leaned forward. Are you accusing us of something? There it was, the pivot, from explanation to offense. I'm trying to understand my credit history, I replied. My father pushed his chair back slightly. After everything we've done for you, this is what you bring to Sunday dinner. The room felt smaller. The wind chime outside rattled in a brief gust of air. For years, this was how it went. A concern raised, reframed as disloyalty. A question turned into proof of my instability. I didn't press further. Not tonight. I have documents coming from the bank, I said instead. I just want clarity. My mother's eyes narrowed. Clarity about what exactly I slid the paper back into my bag. About whether the story I've been told is complete. No one spoke after that. The rest of dinner passed in strained politeness. Caleb left early. My father avoided looking at me. As I drove back toward Austin under a dark Texas sky, my phone buzzed once more. We need to handle this privately, my mother wrote. Before you do something you can't undo. I kept driving. For the first time, I realized the pressure wasn't just about the property. It was about control. and something in their reaction told me that whatever I was about to uncover was not as small as they wanted it to be. The certified envelope arrived on Wednesday morning. I recognized the return address before I opened it, the regional processing center for the bank that had issued the personal loan 15 years earlier. I carried it into my office, closed the door, and sat down before breaking the seal. Inside were photocopies of the original loan application, the signature page, and a summary of disbursement records. $5,800 issued to Hannah Mercer, mailing address Mercer Renovation Services, San Marcos, Texas. I stared at the signature line. It wasn't mine. The shape of the letters was similar enough to pass at a glance. Same looping H, same angled M, but the spacing was off, the pressure uneven. My real signature leaned slightly forward. This one stood upright, cautious. I pulled out a folder from my desk containing old tax returns and a notarized copy of my driver's license application from the same year. I placed the signatures side by side. The differences were subtle, but they were there. For a long moment, I just looked at them. At 21, I had been living in a small apartment near campus, juggling classes and a part-time job. I had barely been able to keep up with my own expenses. I would have remembered applying for a loan. I would have remembered signing my name 5 separate times on a formal document. I reached for the transaction summary. The funds had been deposited into a business checking account, Mercer Renovation Services, not into any account I had ever controlled. The room felt very still. My phone buzzed on the desk. Caleb. I let it go to voicemail. Then a text from my mother followed. We need to stop this before it becomes something ugly. Before it becomes something ugly. As if I were the one creating it. I called Laura Benton's office and asked if she could review the documents as soon as possible. By Thursday afternoon, I was back in her office, the copies spread across her conference table. She studied the signatures carefully. "These are materially different," she said at last. "Enough to justify a formal dispute." "Is it enough to prove intent?" I asked. "That's a separate question," she replied. "But from a compliance standpoint, this supports an identity theft affidavit." The word theft landed heavier than I expected. Laura outlined the process again: sworn affidavit submission to the credit bureau's notification to the originating bank. Once filed, the dispute would trigger investigations, statements would be requested, accounts could be frozen. "Once you do this," she said, meeting my eyes, "you are no longer handling this as a family matter. It becomes institutional." I thought about Sunday dinner, about my father's jaw tightening, my mother's warning to handle it privately. For years, I had absorbed the cost of keeping peace. I had apologized for asking questions. I had carried the quiet embarrassment of accounts that never quite made sense. If I filed the affidavit, that version of me would no longer exist. I drove back to Austin in silence and parked in front of my building. The brick looked different in the late afternoon light, solid, grounded, permanent. Inside my bag was the certified deed with my name printed clearly as sole owner. Inside my other folder were the mismatched signatures, my name in 2 different forms, one earned, one forged. I sat at my desk and began filling out the affidavit form Laura had provided. Line by line, I described the account, the dates, the discrepancies. My handwriting was steady. When I reached the final page, I paused only once at the sentence that declared under penalty of perjury that the information was true. I signed it. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I was done protecting a story that had never protected me. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with a notary, and for the first time in my life, I understood that silence had a cost, and I was no longer willing to pay it. On Friday morning, I stood inside a small UPS store on South Lamar and signed my name in front of a notary who had never met my parents and never would. It was a simple process. I presented my driver's license. She verified my identity, watched me sign the affidavit Laura had prepared, and pressed a raised seal into the final page. The sound of that stamp was softer than I expected, but it carried more weight than any argument I'd ever had at my parents' kitchen table. By noon, the affidavit had been submitted electronically to all 3 credit bureaus, along with copies of the mismatched signatures and the disbursement summary. Laura's office handled the formal notice to the originating bank's compliance department. Everything was documented, time-stamped, logged. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just paperwork moving through systems designed to respond to facts. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was my father. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "What did you file?" he asked without greeting. His voice was not angry. It was tight. "I filed a dispute on the loan," I said, "and an identity theft affidavit." A long pause. "You don't understand how this works," he replied. "Those accounts were handled. We took care of it. Then the documentation should support that," I said evenly. "You're dragging family business into the open," he snapped. "Banks don't see context. They see accusations." I thought about that word. Accusations. I described what's on record, I said. Nothing more. My mother took the phone. I could hear the shift in breathing. "You are blowing this out of proportion," she said. "It was a temporary situation. We paid it back. You weren't harmed." I closed my office door before responding. "My credit report shows otherwise," I said. "And the funds weren't deposited into any account I controlled." Silence again, heavier this time. "You could have come to us first," she said. "I did," I answered quietly. On Sunday. The line went still. For years, that would have been the moment I apologized. I would have said I misunderstood. I would have promised to withdraw whatever complaint I'd made. Instead, I said, "The process is already underway. You need to withdraw it." My father's voice cut back in. "Do you have any idea what this could trigger?" Reviews, freezes, questions. Yes, I did. That was the point. If everything was legitimate, I said, then it will resolve cleanly. My father exhaled sharply. "You're risking your brother's stability over paperwork from 15 years ago." Caleb, there it was, the pressure point. "This isn't about Caleb," I said. "It's about my name." After I hung up, my hands trembled for the first time all day. An hour later, an automated email from one of the credit bureaus confirmed receipt of my dispute. Investigation timeline up to 30 days. The originating bank would be contacted directly. That evening, Caleb called. "Why would you escalate this?" he asked. Not hostile, but strained. "Dad says accounts could be frozen." "I didn't escalate," I said. "I documented." "That's not how it feels down here." Down here, San Marcos, where reputation mattered, where stories were repeated and rarely challenged. In Austin, my deed was recorded under my name alone. In San Marcos, my parents were scrambling to contain something they believed could still be managed privately. I placed the stamped affidavit copy beside the certified deed on my desk. 2 documents. One proved ownership, the other demanded accountability. For the first time, I understood that choosing not to protect them would have consequences, real ones. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to avoid them. By the following Tuesday, the investigation was no longer theoretical. An official letter from the originating bank arrived at my parents' address in San Marcos, addressed to Robert and Diane Mercer as account holders of Mercer Renovation Services. A separate certified notice was delivered to my office in Austin confirming that the disputed loan was under formal review and that the bank's internal compliance unit would require statements from all involved parties. The system had engaged. That afternoon, Caleb showed up at my office unannounced. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Less confident, less certain. "They froze one of Dad's business lines," he said without sitting down. "Not everything, just enough to flag it." I closed my laptop slowly. "That's part of the review process. You knew that would happen. I knew it was possible." Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "My mortgage lender called this morning. They're reviewing our file because our down payment was partially gifted from Mom and Dad last year. Now there's a compliance note attached to their accounts." There it was, the ripple. This wasn't just about a 15-year-old loan anymore. It was about present stability, about how past documentation could disrupt current plans. "I didn't open that loan," I said carefully, "and I didn't deposit that money." "I'm not saying you did," he replied, frustration edging into his voice. "I'm saying this affects more than you." I thought about Sunday dinner, about the years of being told I was reckless, irresponsible, financially unstable. Now the instability had a paper trail. That evening, my father left a voicemail that sounded less defensive and more urgent. "You need to correct this narrative," he said. "The bank is asking questions in writing. They're requesting copies of old contracts. This could trigger a broader audit of the business. Do you understand what that means?" Yes. It meant exposure. It meant that what had once been handled quietly across a kitchen table was now subject to institutional review, documentation, timelines. It meant that intent would be evaluated by people who did not care about family loyalty. The next morning, I received an email from one of the credit bureaus confirming that the disputed account would be marked as under investigation during the review period. My credit score temporarily dipped due to the active dispute notation. I hadn't anticipated that part. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of it. I had just purchased a property. My financing was secure, but any additional expansion plans would now be scrutinized more closely. This wasn't clean or painless. It was complicated. Laura called that afternoon. "This is normal," she said after I explained the freeze and Caleb's mortgage concerns. "Banks contain risk when compliance is involved. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It means the system is functioning." "But if they retaliate," I asked. "They can't legally retaliate for a formal dispute," she replied. "What they can do is provide documentation. And if that documentation contradicts your affidavit, we reassess. Reassess, not retreat." That distinction mattered. Later that week, a formal meeting was scheduled at the regional branch in San Marcos. The bank wanted all relevant parties, present me, my parents, and a compliance officer, to review the loan documentation in person. My father texted only 3 words: "You've made this public." I stared at the framed copy of my deed leaning against the wall, not yet mounted. Public. The record had been public the moment my name went on it. The affidavit had simply required others to look more closely. For the first time, I understood that justice didn't arrive as a single decisive blow. It arrived as a series of reviews, and every review carried risk. But backing down now wouldn't restore stability. It would only confirm the old narrative that I was the one who couldn't handle consequences. The meeting was set for Monday at 10 in the morning. This time, it wouldn't be at a dinner table. Monday at 10 in the morning, I walked into the regional branch of Lone Star Community Bank in San Marcos, carrying 2 folders. One held copies of the disputed loan documents and my sworn affidavit. The other held the certified copy of my deed, not because the bank had requested it, but because I needed the reminder, my name clean and recorded. The branch manager escorted us into a glass-walled conference room. My parents were already seated on one side of the table. My father's posture was rigid. My mother's hands were folded tightly in front of her. Caleb sat near the end, silent. Across from us sat a woman in her early 50s with a navy blazer and a nameplate that read, "Melissa Grant, Senior Compliance Officer." She did not smile in the casual way bank employees usually do. She nodded, opened a folder, and began. "This meeting is to review documentation related to a disputed personal loan issued in 2009, she said evenly. "We will review signature comparisons, disbursement records, and account authorizations." There was no mention of family, no acknowledgement of history, just records. Melissa slid photocopies across the table. My signature from the affidavit, my signature from archived tax filings, then the signature from the loan application. Placed side by side, the differences were no longer subtle. My father shifted in his chair. "Handwriting changes," he said. "It was 15 years ago." Melissa nodded once. "That is correct, which is why we also review supporting metadata." She turned another page. The loan application had been submitted from a desktop IP address registered to Mercer Renovation Services. The funds had been deposited into the business operating account. No written authorization from me appeared in the file beyond the questioned signature. The air in the room felt heavier. Melissa looked at my parents, not at me. "Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, can you provide documentation indicating Ms. Mercer authorized this loan?" My mother's voice was softer now. It was understood. She knew we were struggling at the time. I was in Austin, I said, in school. Melissa held up a hand gently, not to silence me, but to keep the structure intact. We will allow each party to speak in turn. For the first time since this began, I was not the one defending myself. Melissa continued, based on preliminary review, this account will remain flagged as unauthorized pending further documentation. We will require written statements from all parties within 10 business days. During this period, certain lines of credit connected to Mercer renovation services may remain restricted. There it was, not a verdict, not punishment, restriction, process. My father leaned forward. This is damaging our business. Melissa's expression did not change. Our responsibility is to the integrity of the account. Integrity, the word lingered. The meeting lasted less than an hour. When it ended, my parents stood without looking at me. Caleb paused near the door. This is bigger than I thought, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. Outside, the Texas sun felt brighter than it had that morning. I sat in my car and exhaled slowly. There had been no dramatic confession, no apology, no collapse, but something had shifted. For years, my parents controlled the narrative by speaking first and speaking loudest. In that conference room, the documents had spoken, not with anger, with sequence, timeline, authorization, deposit trail. As I drove back toward Austin, I realized the meeting had clarified something essential. This wasn't about forcing them to admit wrongdoing in front of me. It was about ensuring the system saw what I had seen. The investigation wasn't over. Statements still had to be submitted. Reviews still had to be completed. But control no longer rested solely in their hands. And for the first time since Sunday dinner, I felt something steady return. Not victory, leverage. 30 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, the final notice arrived in my inbox. Subject line, dispute resolution update. I didn't open it immediately. I let it sit there while I finished reconciling payroll reports for a client. I had learned something over the past month. Systems move at their own pace. Panic doesn't accelerate them. When I finally clicked the email, the language was clinical. The disputed personal loan issued in 2009 had been determined to lack sufficient authorization. The account would be permanently removed from my credit file. The original lender had adjusted its internal records to reflect unauthorized use pending restitution review. Unauthorized use, not misunderstanding, not family arrangement, unauthorized. A second letter followed from the originating bank. Mercer Renovation Services had entered into a structured repayment agreement related to internal compliance findings. Certain business credit privileges would remain restricted until resolution. Additional documentation requirements would apply to future borrowing. It was not a public scandal, it was consequence. My phone rang within the hour. This time it wasn't anger, it was my mother. They're requiring written acknowledgement, she said quietly. Your father had to sign something. I waited. They're restructuring our lines, she continued. It's temporary. Temporary? The same word they had used 15 years ago. This didn't have to happen, she added. I looked around my office, the framed deed now mounted on the wall behind my desk. The lease agreements for my tenants neatly organized, the new plaque outside reading Mercer Accounting and Advisory. It already happened, I said. She didn't respond. Later that evening, Caleb called. They're reviewing everything he said. Business accounts, tax filings, even vendor contracts. That's how compliance works, I replied. He hesitated. Dad says the bank won't extend any new lines until this is fully resolved. That meant stalled renovations, delayed projects, slower cash flow, real impact. For years, I had absorbed the hidden cost of that $5,800 loan, higher interest rates, unexplained credit fluctuations, quiet doubt from lenders. It had followed me invisibly. Now the cost had a visible ledger. The next morning, I pulled my updated credit report. The loan was gone. My score had rebounded. Clean history, no active disputes. I sat with that for a long moment. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was clarity. A week later, I spoke at a small business association meeting in Austin about financial literacy and identity protection. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't name the loan. I spoke about documentation, about reviewing credit annually, about not dismissing irregularities because they're uncomfortable. Afterward, a retired contractor in his late 60s approached me. "Wish I'd done that years ago," he said. "Would have saved me trouble." I nodded. Across town in San Marcos, my parents were meeting with accountants and compliance officers. Their business continued but slower. More scrutiny, more oversight, not collapse. Correction, the system hadn't punished them in a dramatic way. It had recalibrated risk, and in doing so, it had restored mine. That evening, as I locked my office and glanced at the deed on the wall, I understood something that had taken me 32 years to learn. Accountability doesn't arrive with noise, it arrives in writing, and once written, it doesn't disappear. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in early October when my parents came to Austin. They didn't call ahead this time to argue. They asked if we could meet. We chose a small coffee shop halfway between my office and the highway back to San Marcos. Neutral ground, public but not performative. My father looked older than he had a month earlier. Not frail, just worn. My mother carried a folder, the same kind I had been carrying for weeks. They sat across from me, and for the first time in my adult life, no one began by correcting me. The bank finalized everything my father said. "We've signed the repayment agreement. They've adjusted the business accounts. There will be oversight for a while." He didn't say it was unfair. He didn't say I overreacted. My mother slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't legal language this time. It was a typed statement acknowledging that the loan had been taken without my written authorization and that responsibility rested with them. "We were trying to keep the business afloat," she said. "We told ourselves it was temporary. We told ourselves you'd never feel it." I looked at the paper but didn't reach for it yet. "I did feel it," I said. "For years. Higher interest rates, rejected pre-approvals, the quiet suspicion in loan officers' voices." My father nodded slowly. "We see that now. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't emotional. It was measured, almost formal. But it was honest. "I'm not pressing charges," I said. "I never planned to. I needed the record corrected." My mother's shoulders dropped slightly at that. "We understand," she replied. "We won't ask you to withdraw anything. It's done, done." The word felt different from temporary. We talked for another half hour about practical things. About Caleb's mortgage review, which had cleared once the bank confirmed the repayment structure. About the compliance restrictions that would remain in place for their business for the next year. Consequences had settled into routine. When we stood to leave, my father paused. "You built something solid," he said. "We should have said that sooner. I didn't rush to forgive. I didn't rush to embrace them either. But I felt something steady inside me that hadn't been there before." My name was no longer attached to a debt I hadn't created. It was attached to a deed, to a business license, to clients who trusted me. That night, back in my office, I turned off the lights and glanced once more at the framed deed on the wall. For years, I had tried to earn validation from people who had already decided who I was. Now my validation was recorded elsewhere at the county clerk's office, in compliance files and corrected credit histories. Justice hadn't restored my childhood. It hadn't erased the years of doubt. But it had restored accuracy, and accuracy was enough. The next morning, I scheduled a workshop at the community center in East Austin about understanding credit reports and protecting your name. I wasn't doing it to prove anything. I was doing it because I finally understood the value of seeing your own record clearly and refusing to let anyone else write it for you. My parents drove back to San Marcos. I stayed in Austin, not separated by anger, separated by boundaries, and for the first time that felt like peace. If this story resonates with you, share your thoughts about Justice Family and what healing has meant in your own life. Consider subscribing for more real stories about accountability and resilience, and explore the next story waiting for you.